Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you very much for that welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to all of the organizers of this event. I'm really excited about it. We've got time for questions, lots of time for questions at the end, and I'm excited about that possibility too. It's been an exciting week for me, and I wanted to share one of my other excitements with you, which is that my grandson was born about a week ago. With that, though, let me move on and try to talk about what the subject of this evening is. What I want to focus on in talking about science and faith is something that I call scientism. What is scientism? Scientism is the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. And I think scientism is at the heart of the question of the relationship between science and Christianity, or science and religious faith. So much so that I've written a book about it, and I'll be just taking a few ideas out of the book, and if you want to go really much deeper, please buy the book. What the book does is to try to explore the history of scientism, its justification, the extent to which it's well justified, its influence on society, and in particular on the intellect, and what the consequences of that scientistic belief is. When I mention scientism, a lot of people haven't heard the word before, and a lot of people will be surprised that anyone would actually adopt that belief. But actually, that belief, I think, is very widespread. In fact, it might even be thought to be the default belief in the academy today. Take, for example, the writings of Richard Dawkins. In his book, The God Delusion, he says on a number of different occasions something like, "The existence of God is a scientific hypothesis like any other." Or Paul Thagard, in a book called The Brain and the Meaning of Life, says, "What is reality? Those things and processes identified by well-established fields of science using theories backed by evidence drawn from systematic observations and experiments." In other words, science is what tells you what reality is. Now, actually, this kind of approach to scientism is rarely put as clearly as that. But the most clear espousal of scientism that I'm aware of are these words from Alex Rosenberg, philosopher from Duke University. He refers to scientism, and he uses the definition that I've given you of scientism, and he says that he's adopting it. He says that science provides all the significant truths there are about reality. And in case you didn't quite get the message, he finally says, once you adopt science, you'll be able to cease treating the humanities as knowledge. That's pretty direct, isn't it? But more often than not, scientism is much more implicit. It's a background assumption. It's rarely advocated directly. But it's an implicit part very often of the discussion that we experience. Now, what am I going to cover today? I want to basically speak about three different sections of my talk. First of all, I want to talk about science, what it is, its methods, and its competence. Secondly, I'll go into more depth about what scientism is, a distortion, I believe, of science into what is going to amount to, and does amount to, a religious worldview. And then thirdly, I want to draw some contrast between Christianity and secular scientism. So first of all then, what do we actually mean by the word science? One reason that scientism is able to flourish, as I believe it does in our academy and in our society today, is a misunderstanding or an ambiguity about what is meant by the word science. This is in part because historically the word science was used differently from the way it's used today. The Latin derivation of the word science is it comes from the word scientia, which simply means knowledge. And long ago, that was the meaning of the English word science. It simply meant any organized, systematic form of knowledge. That was true in Enlightenment times. For example, in the 18th century, the Encyclopédie of Diderot, written in French, of course, used the word science to mean any kind of knowledge. And yet it was an encyclopedia, mostly of science and technology. In the 19th century, a historian like Thomas Macaulay could use the word science to mean the growth of the human mind. And even in the 20th century, as late as 1940, the philosopher R.G. Collingwood could say that science is any body of systematic or orderly thinking. Now, if this really were still what we mean by science, then I submit to you that scientism, as I've defined it, the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is, would be true by tautology, essentially. It would be true by definition. Because if science is simply knowledge, then clearly science is all the knowledge there is. But that isn't what we mean today when we're talking about science. When we use the word science unqualified, what we mean is what used once to be called natural philosophy, the study of nature. It's the modern science that we inherited from the scientific revolution. And that's what I mean when I'm going to be talking today about science and faith. If we're talking about science and religion, for example, we're not talking about reconciling the gods and goddesses of Greek mythology with, let's say, the latest economic theory. No, we're talking about the compatibility, in my case of Christianity, with a modern understanding of physics, cosmology, geology, chemistry, biology, and so on. And science and faith, the relationship between science and religious faith, is a vital issue for our society precisely because natural science has a kind of epistemological prestige that arises from its amazing growth and success in describing the natural world. If science still meant that archaic meaning of just any contemplative knowledge, then I submit to you that theology would certainly still be a science. It wouldn't perhaps these days be its queen, the queen of the sciences as it was once spoken of. But I would be happy to say today that theology is not a science in the sense we mean science today. It's not a natural science. Okay, well, if we're talking about natural science, then one way to try to understand what science is would be to say, well, isn't science just the study of nature? And isn't it really just unlimited in the ways that it goes around about finding out about nature? We're just going to use the very best methods we want and we can find. That, though, is actually not a very good way of understanding what science really is. And the reason why defining science as the study of nature doesn't work is because the meaning of the word nature is itself very ambiguous. This was recognized really in the early days of the scientific revolution. This gentleman here is Robert Boyle, the Boyle of Boyle's Law. He was one of the founders of the Royal Society in London, and, by the way, a devoted Christian. But he recognized that the meaning of the word nature is very ambiguous. In fact, he wrote a whole book about it, entitled A Free Inquiry into the Vulgarly Received Notion of Nature. Wonderful title, isn't it? And in this book, he cites 8 possible different meanings of the word nature. And the whole thrust of his book is to deprecate and to argue against the meaning of nature that Aristotle had, which was Aristotle's science whereby heavy objects fell because they had an intrinsic nature of downness to them. That was the kind of nature that Boyle was against. And he was arguing in favor of the meaning of nature being the normal or settled course of events or course of things. But at any rate, the point is that it isn't self-explanatory that we understand what the meaning of nature is. And therefore, I believe the right way and the meaningful way to understand what science is and to define science, if you like, is through its methods rather than in terms of its topics. And the important point is that if science has well-defined methods, it may not be the case, and in fact it isn't the case, I'm going to argue, that those methods apply to all forms of knowledge. So what are science's methods? I think science has some very distinctive characteristics, most of which we're all kind of familiar with, although we perhaps haven't made a list of them, but they're things that are listed up here, things like observation, experiment, measurement, systematization, mathematization, and so forth. And these characteristics of science, I believe, can be brought together into 2 primary abstract categories. And so we can really, in a certain sense, boil down what we mean by natural science into the insistence upon reproducibility. So science depends upon repeatable experiments or observations. And clarity, and this means the unambiguous descriptions, things like measurement, sometimes things like mathematics, that science insists upon. And these characteristics, I would say, imply that science's scope of application is limited. And I want to unpack these ideas just a little bit more. Michael Faraday was a fascinating character in the history of science. He had almost no formal education. He left school at age 13 and was apprenticed to a bookbinder, Mr. Ribot. And that's where he got his education. It was a very interesting self-education. And he rose to be the most famous experimental scientist in the early part of the 19th century in England. And he has no less than 5 different phenomena or laws of physical science that are named after him. And Faraday used to say that he had an imagination, an amazingly strong imagination, and that imagination had to be reined in, it had to be channeled by what he would call the facts. So he says, the facts are important to me and saved me. Or he said on another occasion, without experiment, I am nothing. So Faraday recognized that the absolute foundation of natural science, the natural science that he helped to develop, was repeatable experiments. It was said of Faraday that whenever he read or heard of some new phenomenon in those heady days of the development of electricity and magnetism, the first thing that he would do is he would go down into his lab in the Royal Institution in London and try to reproduce the phenomenon that had been reported by another scientist, because reproducibility of experiment was so important. And I like to think of this woodcut showing Faraday's lab at the Royal Institution as a sort of symbol of Michael Faraday going down and trying to repeat those experiments. Did this, by the way, mean that Faraday himself was an arch skeptic? Not, on the contrary. He was himself a very committed Christian, lifelong Christian. He belonged to the nonconformist Sandemanian church and was for extended periods of his adult life the elder, which in that denomination meant the pastor of the congregation. Now, one objection one might raise to the insistence that science depends upon reproducibility is to say, well, what about observations? I mean, if we think about, let's say, astronomy, we can't do experiments on the stars, and so how can it be, that reproducible experiments is essential to science, and that's what you're saying, Ian. So what about it? Well, the answer is, actually, it's still the case that in observational sciences, reproducibility is important. In fact, one of the reasons why astronomy was the first of sciences was that anyone, anywhere can look into the skies and see very systematic, reproducible motions of the stars that can be systematized and characterized. It's a common vision. And what's more, even seemingly unique events like a supernova, which in this case, this is a picture taken by the Hubble telescope of the Crab Nebula. Even a supernova, which is, after all, a one-off event, leaves remnants that can be reproducibly observed by essentially anyone with a halfway decent telescope these days. So when we talk about reproducibility, we're not just talking about the ability to do an experiment over again. Reproducibility doesn't necessarily mean reproducibility at will, but in the observational sciences, it's the opportunity to have many different examples. But in life and in the world, there are many, many things, very important things, which are simply not reproducible. And I think history is the clearest example of a discipline that concerns itself with issues that are not, by and large, reproducible. Only a tiny fraction of the activities of history benefit from anything that bears the stamp of natural sciences. How do we know the truth of the statement that Julius Caesar was assassinated on the steps of the Roman Senate on the Ides of March in 44 BC? Not by experiment, not by reproducible observation, and yet we do know that fact. That is a fact. It's part of unreal knowledge. History hasn't real knowledge. It's just not scientific knowledge. Or economics. It's another example of a very rigorous discipline, but it's not something that can do reproducible experiments. And hence, I would argue it's not a science in the sense that the natural sciences are. Or politics. You know, we speak about political science. But politics exchanges the kind of reproducibility that we seek in the natural sciences for pragmatism and public opinion. I would argue that the study of politics is not a science in the same way that the natural sciences are. It's not a science in the modern sense of the unqualified word. Now, of course, when I say this, it's often in the academy, and this reaction may be out there right now. Folks in these types of disciplines may well bristle. Okay, they may think that I'm belittling their discipline by saying that it's not a science. But that's precisely the point. I don't subscribe to scientism. I don't think that science is all the real knowledge there is. So for me to say that these disciplines are not science is not belittling them, because I don't take the viewpoint of scientism. But of course, scientism is such a default position in the academy today that for someone to say something isn't a science seems like an insult. So my colleagues may bristle, but I would assert that they ought not. And yet it is their disciplines, in addition to the rest of the academy, are influenced by scientism. I need to keep going. My second characteristic of science is clarity. So clarity is, I'm using this word in a kind of specialized sense, it's a foundational requirement for the expression and communication of reproducibility. If you can't express clearly what the results of an experiment are, you won't be able to tell whether, if you repeat it or if someone else repeats it, you actually got the same result. So it's vital to have some kind of expression that is sufficiently unambiguous. And the whole idea of measurement is one of the most important ways in science in which we get clarity. This, by the way, is a photograph of the Danish replica of the standard kilogram. The kilogram is the unit the only remaining fundamental unit that we calibrate by means of an artifact. So measurement is one of the vital parts of giving rise to clarity. And of course, mathematics, particularly in the physical and chemical, and these days even biological sciences, is one of the crucial ways in which we express clarity. We reduce nature to numbers, and then we operate on those using mathematics. But the reason I use a rather abstract term like clarity rather than mathematics is that I actually don't think it's helpful to say that science insists on mathematical description, because I think there are lots of things in science which are aimed at and are foundational in obtaining this clarity, but they're not really mathematics. So if you think about, for example, the botany in its early stages, the findings of specimens out in the wild, so to speak, that involves enormous amounts of field skills, very important classification processes, which it isn't really very helpful to think of in terms of mathematics, but which are very much aimed at providing the kind of clarity that I'm thinking of. So clarity is a requirement of the natural sciences. But many, many topics in the world and in our lives fundamentally lack that kind of clarity, that freedom from ambiguity that science insists upon. And so here I'm offering you a few examples. I won't read them out. But none of these topics, I submit, can be meaningfully ascribed the clarity that is required by science. And that doesn't mean you can't scientifically analyze parts of these questions. If you take the sunset, for example, science has a perfectly good description of why the sun looks, orange or yellow as it's setting, why the colors are graded in the sky because of the scattering of sunlight and the dust that's in the atmosphere, and so on and so forth. There can be a perfectly comprehensive description of the scientific basis for why the sky looks the way it does. But once that scientific description has been offered, you realize it's kind of missed the point. It's missed the beauty. It hasn't described the beauty. The illustration that I like to give of this question of clarity and the example of things which don't possess that kind of clarity is music. So here's an example. I hope this is going to play. Ask yourself the question, what is this event? Okay, what is this event? Well, a scientific description of this event might consist of saying, we have certain pieces of an alloy, metallic alloy, mostly copper, that are brought together in such a way that the electrons in the surfaces interfere with one another. This generates a momentum impulse which is then transferred to the atoms of the lattice. It propagates as a sound wave through the lattice. It then couples to the air round about, and compressional waves are launched out into the outside world. So that's the scientific description. It's actually a perfectly correct scientific description of what that young lady was doing. Okay? So that's one way to describe it. Another way to describe it would be to say, well, she took symbols and crashed them together. Or he took, we might be misled by him. He wasn't actually trying to build something. He wasn't really hammering, right? I mean, he took the hammer and he crashed it down on the anvil. Okay, that's another way to describe this. But of course, even that's inadequate, because these aren't people on their own doing their own thing. No, they're actually part of a symphony orchestra, right? So they're actually very important at this particular moment, important parts of the whole. But, and so that there's a bunch of other people doing things simultaneously with them. But the things that they're doing simultaneously also, that at another level, have a very important significance. This is actually the hammer blow from the finale of Mahler's Sixth Symphony. And then there's the audience out there, okay? And they are hearing this symphony. And actually, music itself, its meanings, aren't present in any kind of scientific description of the sound waves in isolation. They're actually elicited only by the very act of listening or hearing the music and the connection to the music. And perhaps for some people in the audience, there are kind of reminiscences, or they've heard this piece before, or it relates to something in their human lives and evokes that reaction. And of course, all of that is fraught with ambiguity and uncertainty and mystery, and in a certain sense, it's completely impossible to convey that in scientific terminology. Now, those two characteristics which science insists upon, I assert, limit its scope of application. It can't be applied usefully to describe comprehensively things that don't have reproducibility or don't have clarity. And that means that certain parts of our knowledge and our lives are ruled out. One very important part is the question of purpose. So I offer you this quote from the Nobel Prize-winning biologist Jacques Monod. He writes, it's quite an old quote now, "The cornerstone of the scientific method is the postulate that nature is objective. In other words, the systematic denial that true knowledge can be got at by interpreting phenomena in terms of final causes, that is to say, of purpose." Now, I like to quote this for two reasons. The first reason is that this is a classic example of implicit or hidden scientism. So if you have to parse what he says rather carefully to get it. But what you see is in the first sentence, he's talking about scientific method, and in the second sentence, he's talking about true knowledge, and he's basically identifying the two. So he's implicitly saying that science is all the true knowledge that there is. In other words, this is a scientistic statement, okay? And for that reason, that aspect of it I reject. But I also like this statement because I think actually there's a great deal of truth in it. It's not a true statement about all of knowledge, but it is a true statement about scientific knowledge. That scientific knowledge, the modern scientific knowledge that we pursue today, does by and large, and in fact as a matter of principle, because of the kinds of discussions that I alluded to when referring to Robert Boyle, rule out purpose from its methods of analysis and from its explanation. It does this in large part because personality and purpose are concepts that don't possess the clarity and reproducibility that science insists upon. And there is a sense in which they can never be a scientific description of personality and purpose, and that must therefore be looked for in non-scientific terms. Okay, I must keep moving. My second topic is I promised to say something about scientism. Well, I've been saying quite a bit about scientism already. Scientism is not a finding of science. It's a worldview. It's a worldview that has an integrating cosmology. That is, it has an integrated understanding of how the world is and what it fundamentally goes to make it up. It has an interpretive lens or filter. In other words, it's something that you look through that colors your interpretation of the world if you adopt a scientistic position. And it has a number of other things. For example, it has a justifying narrative history. It has, you might be surprised to know, it has a community of believers, and those believers, that community, look to scientism as a source of ethics. Now, why have I pointed at these things out? I've pointed them out because I submit that these are the kinds of characteristics of a religion. Let me say something about the justifying narrative of scientism. I think the common picture that portrays science and religion as permanently at war is a part of that justifying narrative of scientism. And it's been a commonplace since at least Galileo to adopt this position. And this picture, this painting, is in a certain sense an icon of this myth that science and religion have permanently been at war. Of course, it is Galileo confronting or being confronted by the Roman Inquisition. And actually, I won't take the time to describe this painting in depth, but there are lots of features of this painting which are to do with the fact that it has a message. I mean, in the first place, look at Galileo's stance, okay? I mean, he is being portrayed as this great hero of science. He's got this heroic pose. What's more, round his head, there is a light region, and actually, looks like a halo, doesn't it? He's a sainted hero. He's a sainted martyr hero of science. Well, the point I want to make, though, about this painting, I won't go into any more depth, is the interesting thing is when it was painted. 1857. You see, even though the justifying narrative history of scientism as we know it today portrays science and religious faith as having been permanently at war, in fact, that idea, that myth, is not all that terribly old. It really got hold in the middle of the 19th century, and in fact, it was part of a deliberate campaign waged by the secularizers of the academy, those who thought it was time to overthrow Christianity's control of higher education. And they set out to do that, and this story, this justifying narrative history of scientism, was a deliberate part of that campaign. Of course, actually this was, in a certain sense, a successful objective. By the end of the 19th century, most universities had largely moved away from religious authority, and in their place, scientism became the default position. Let me say a couple of things about the community. Positivism was a type of scientism that was advocated in the first instance by Auguste Comte in the beginning of the 19th century. And he believed that all knowledge had to pass through three stages. It started off with the theological or fictitious, then it went through the metaphysical or abstract, and then finally it became scientific or positive. And that's where the positive is where the positivists get their name from, of course. This was a scientistic vision, that all knowledge was going to become scientific, positive in the end. Now, the interesting thing about positivism is that, like several other movements of the same era, it actually became a deliberate religion. And not just like a religion, it had a hierarchical priesthood, it had public services of commemoration, daily prayers, 9 personal sacraments, 81 annual festivals. Here is a positivist temple that is still standing in Brazil. So not only is scientism and was scientism a worldview, it was actually, in some cases, a specifically religious worldview. What about the question of ethics? There's a long history, particularly since the publication of The Origin of Species, of social Darwinisms being used as a way of trying to derive ethics. I won't go through the details of Spencer's Darwinism applied to the society which persuaded him that laissez-faire capitalism was the way to go. And I won't spend a lot of time either on the question of Francis Galton's thoughts about eugenics, which became very widely held, never uncontroversially, but nevertheless very widely held, both in Britain and in America and Germany. Now, of course, The outcome of that was the Holocaust, and the civilized world was so repelled from eugenics by what it saw that it had led to, that they revolted against it. But it's still the case that things very like these arguments are at work today. So you may have heard of sociobiology. That is a new view of a way in which we should derive our ethics from evolutionary arguments. Or evolutionary psychology is very commonplace today. It's attempting to derive ethical principles from science, particularly the science that's associated with evolution. Now, what's the problem with this? The problem with this is fundamentally that you can't get an ought from an is, and that as a result, these arguments simply don't give you the kind of ethics that has serious ethical force. They can be twisted to support practically anything. So I would argue then, when we come to this question of science and Christianity, it isn't that science and Christianity are incompatible. There is an incompatibility. There is, if you like, a warfare that exists. But it isn't between science and Christianity. It's between scientism and Christianity, yes, but a whole lot of other non-scientific disciplines that are distorted and belittled by scientism. Scientism, in my view, is the thing that is incompatible with Christianity. Science and Christianity are not, in my view, incompatible, although they may be mutually corrective, or they may constrain one another. They're not completely overlapping. They're not, they often do have something to say about the same things. But they're not incompatible because if you distinguish science from scientism, then you're able to see that scientific and non-scientific disciplines can be simultaneously, scientific and non-scientific descriptions can be simultaneously valid. So in that musical interlude, all of the descriptions at different levels were true simultaneously. And I think that is the crucial point, which I think enables one to understand the world more comprehensively and give credence to the non-scientific disciplines just as much as one does to the scientific ones. And by the way, this isn't simply the reaction of, a believer or a religion that wants to give itself some kind of space in the face of the growing scientific understanding of the world. This is not a new invention, the idea that scientific and non-scientific descriptions can simultaneously be valid. It's always been the viewpoint that one finds in, for example, the Bible. So the scriptural viewpoint is that even if things have a natural explanation, then they can also have a spiritual explanation. It's a viewpoint that was practiced. It was practiced very much by the founders of the scientific revolution, who spoke in terms of there being two books, the book of God's word, the Bible, and the book of God's works, meaning nature, both of which were to be read and testified to God. And I've tried to show you that this viewpoint is also philosophically necessary. Otherwise, you can't make sense of non-scientific disciplines, quite apart from whether they are questions of religion. But let me now then come to a contrast between the secular, or let's say asecular view, which I think is a very common, widely held secular view in our society, in our academy today in Christianity. So I think it's not saying too much to say that the kind of default secular view in the academy today is that there is no reality beyond what is discovered by science, and that there is no higher moral authority or good than the freedom of the individual. Now, Christianity has a different view. Christianity says, yes, science and personal freedom are good. But the Christian view is that both the deepest reality and the highest good or moral authority are to be found in loving relationship. Christians believe that this universe exists because a God whose nature is love, expressed in relationship, has made it and loves it. And we believe that individuals find their truest fulfillment in entering freely into a loving relationship with God and with one another. But we recognize as we look around us that all is not love. There's a great deal of pain and alienation and anger and strife and war. But Christians say that God has entered into his creation in the person of a human, Jesus, and that he has taken upon himself that alienation and pain, and at tremendous cost has overcome it. And that this stupendous redeeming act echoes up and down history. Now, that Christian belief is not something that I think one could reasonably expect to be proved or disproved by science. But that does not mean that it is irrational or without any ability to be argued, tested, or experienced. So, just to finish off, if it isn't by science that we find out whether Christianity is true, how would we find out whether Christianity is true? Well, I think one would have to use one's intelligence and use, for example, the primary documents. The New Testament, after all, is free for examination and has been examined in enormous detail. But I would encourage you, if you're interested in this question of is Christianity true, that's where you would probably want to start. You might read the New Testament, but it's rather important, I think, to understand that presuppositions are also important. If you read the New Testament starting with the presupposition that you know that miracles don't happen, then you're going to come to certain conclusions about what you read there. I think you have to have a certain degree of openness if you're serious about exploring Christianity's truthfulness. I would argue that works both ways. So I certainly would say if you want to intellectually explore Christianity, you would come to the New Testament with openness to the possibility of miracles, but you wouldn't insist that you must believe the Bible is, the absolute truth before you start to read it. That would be foolishness. Of course, someone who isn't a Christian isn't necessarily going to believe that. I mean, Christians like me do have a high regard for the Bible and think that it's an important witness to the things we believe in. But I wouldn't necessarily think that someone who wasn't a Christian would come to the New Testament with that presumption. So there's an openness. Focus on Jesus. After all, Christianity is about him. Was he an historical figure? Are the main texts about him really what was originally written, or are they unreliable because of corruption over the centuries? That's a reasonable question. What sort of life was his? What were his teachings? Actually, very interesting, focused on himself, and that has certain consequences. And the most important question, I think, that Christians have always regarded as the linchpin or the hinge of Christianity is did Jesus rise from the dead? Think about those apostles, what transformed the early Christians into what they became. What's the evidence? This is, of course, evidence. It's not necessarily scientific evidence. It's circumstantial evidence sometimes. It's documentary evidence. There might be some scientific evidence, but that won't be predominant. There'll be logic, there'll be testimony, and so on. And in the end, I think one should ask oneself that if there were such a God and Savior, so engaged with his creation, desiring a personal involvement with individuals? How would one discover that? And I would suggest that the way that one would discover that is to be open to it. And I think that that is an important aspect of what Christians refer to as faith. So, contradictions? I don't think so. I think there is a reality in which one can be both a scientist and a believer, and that provided one understands the distinction between science and scientism, the route is open for a serious intellectual engagement with the claims of Jesus Christ. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Professor Hutchinson for your time. We are now going to open up the discussion section of this evening.
I'm going to frame what you call scientism in a slightly more positive light. Let's call a scientist somebody who is essentially an intellectual conservative, somebody who basically holds it, well, if I don't have empirical knowledge of it, it's probably better not to actually go forward and explore that too far, because ultimately I might simply get to an understanding of how things are rather than the fact. How would you actually address somebody like that and talk to them about what they might be missing?
Well, first of all, I am a scientist, so I would argue that I practice science on a professional basis routinely. So I think I know what science is. I think your positive framing is a reasonable description of the way we try to go about developing scientific knowledge. The question, though, is whether we can or should expect that all knowledge will be of that type. And I think the answer has to be no. The truth of the matter is that humans are obliged, because of our life circumstances, to make decisions on the basis of incomplete and very often inadequate knowledge every moment of our waking lives. And so it's completely impossible to live a life in which you refuse to make decisions or move forward without having a thorough or even a scientific analysis of that situation. And I would argue that another aspect of the meaning of faith is the recognition that we cannot know all of the answers. We cannot have complete information. We have to make our best decision based on the knowledge we have, and then we have to live out our lives and pursue our activities as consistently with that. And I would say that faith, religious faith, is that kind of principle, which is after all the principle of the go-getters in this world, applied to matters of the spirit.
Well, I'd like to point out that there is another microphone over here if people would like to line up there. If not, we're just going to keep going with this microphone for now.
Thank you, Professor. I was wondering what your personal journey to faith was, whether you always had it, you were an atheist, you converted, and whether you ever have doubts. If you could just talk about that.
I did not grow up in a Christian family. My parents were not Christians. We did not go to church. I became a Christian when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge University. I became persuaded that the evidence for Christianity is very good, and that I would not know truly the truth of Christianity without doing something about it. And I found that to be a reality.
Hello, Professor Hutchinson. I was curious whether you think the discoveries of cognitive science will help promote further discussion between science and faith.
I think they could, and I hope and believe that there's an opportunity for that to happen. And you at Stanford have a very distinguished neuroscientist on your faculty. He was also a Christian, Bill Newsom, who's in the audience. And I hope he will be able to help us a lot on that, Bill. But let me say one or two remarks about that. I think, first of all, that cognitive science is very much in its early stages, and I'm sure Bill would endorse that. There have been a number of important developments. We're now to the point where we can actually make, for example, very rudimentary measurements inside the brain and so forth. So I think we're making some progress. We're a long way from having a complete description of the brain, but we're making progress, and maybe there's going to be a big national initiative to make even more progress. Even if one reached, and we're very far from this, even if one reached the point where you have a complete physical description of how the brain works, this, in my view, would not undermine the reality of knowledge. It couldn't possibly undermine the reality of the mind. Because if it did, then in other words, if there is some kind of mental or neurological determinism, then it would contradict the very knowledge that we are trying to develop ourselves. In other words, if my knowledge, if my statements are nothing more than the random firings of neurons, then why would I believe that statement to be true? Okay? It's self-defeating. So there must, behind it all, be some reality to the knowledge, the expression, the mind itself, in my opinion. Otherwise, we couldn't think. Actually, that's completely commonplace. I mean, if you think about computers, computers are a great example. Now, I don't mean to say that the brain is a computer. I don't know whether the brain's a computer. It certainly isn't a computer of the type we have at the moment. But we are now in our society extremely familiar with the idea that there can be hardware and there can be software. And if you're trying to explain a computer program, if you focus on the bits and the switches, the transistors of the hardware, then you will actually end up not getting a significant description of what the computer program is supposed to be about. In other words, we are very familiar in the sciences and in technology, such as computer technology, of descriptions at different levels, and that they have equal, sometimes different, significance. And I simply am saying that will continue to apply to the person, and therefore we will still, however much we might have a physical description of the way the brain works, we'll still be in the same position with respect to the question of mind, perhaps with some greater specific insights. Thank you for that question.
Thanks for your talk. I had two questions, but I think you just answered one of them.
Oh, good.
My first question was going to be how you would respond to somebody who said, you mentioned things like economics and maybe meaning of music does not have the level of clarity, that can be captured by a mathematical equation. But, one could claim that there are some sort of emergent behavior that's a consequence of, some fundamental evolutionary or biological process. But I think you just answered that question.
Okay, what's your other question?
My other question is, what is your position on, in cases where people who take the literal account of, let's say, the creation of the world, and when they seem to contradict with scientific evidence, how do you reconcile cases? For instance, fossils and things like that.
Okay, it's probably the case that if you to study the history, you'll find that 400 or 500 years ago, most people in the world believed that the world was quite young, that it was a few thousand years old. And certainly in the Christian West, this was thought at that time to be consistent with the Bible. Today, we know that the world is not just a few thousand years old. We know that the Earth is 4 billion years old, and the universe is 13.6 something, and that something keeps changing, actually. It just got corrected a little bit. Billion years old. So that's an example, I would say, where beliefs which were at least, let's say, embodied or entangled in interpretations of the Bible have been corrected by science. And I take the view that, and this is not a new idea because it's an idea which dates back to St. Augustine, you know, in the early centuries of Christianity, that the Bible is not intended to be a science textbook. And one shouldn't go to the Bible looking for scientific descriptions of the world. You asked me, well, what do I do about people, Christians? There are some Christians who take a different view on this. They say, no, the Bible is true scientifically. It has to be true scientifically. What do I do about them? I say politely to them, I don't agree. And in fact, as far as I'm concerned, the whole of physical science as we understand it indicates that the universe is far older than a few thousand years.
Hello. Thanks a lot for your talk. I just have one question. My major is in economics and business.
Oh gosh. I'm in trouble.
In that major, the question is, why should we care? And it has a more pragmatic view. So we use statistics, and in that major, famous quote is that all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. So we care about how useful a model is. Based on that methodology, one can argue that why having a Christian attitude can be useful. So, for example, I come from Iran, so it's ruled by a religious government, and there is Islamic faith over there. And to me, as I lived there for 24 years, one of the consequences of that faith was whenever something was happening, then people were trying to explain that by those ideologies based on the Islamic faith. But another approach was trying to figure out what's going on based on the models and the theories that we know that they're not perfect, but some of them were useful. So how can not specifically Christianity, but any religious attitude add value, and how can you compare that with the theories based on the fact that we know that they are not correct, and it's in the spectrum?
Okay, I think I get it. Yeah, okay, so thank you for that question. Well, first of all, I don't wish to argue against economics, and I think that actually economics is a very, very mathematical and rigorous discipline, and that's quite obvious. But what I do want to argue is that economics is dealing with situations in which it can't do reproducible experiments, number one, and it isn't in a situation where it can expect to find the kinds of universal laws that we find in the natural sciences. Now, is it useful? Are the models of economics useful? Yes, of course they are. They're not nearly as accurate or reliable as many economists would have us to believe, but they're nevertheless useful. Now, I think, so that's one point. Second point, I don't want to be put in a position of defending all religion, okay? That's not my business here. I won't even defend all of what Christianity does. I was just asked a question about Christians, and I didn't defend them, okay? But if you ask the question, what good is religion, okay, then that is a very remarkably modernistic question. Because after all, religion has infused human society since the first records that we have. And I think that it's a kind of question which actually betrays a totally pragmatic viewpoint with which I would take issue. I think when we're talking about what good is something, you've got to decide, well, what is good? You know? And simply to presume that good is economic prosperity or growth of 3.5% or what those kinds of things are, seems to me to leave me cold. I don't regard those as being ultimate goods. And so that's another aspect, by the way, in which I think that economics is in a position which is different from the natural sciences, because it has to make, in a certain sense, the kinds of value judgments, and it tends to do this a little bit in ways which I find, are somewhat, let's say, somewhat questionable. So I would argue that one good that religion provides very importantly, is a description of what is virtue, what is value, what is good. And I think that's a very important thing. But thank you for your question. Yeah.
Next question over here.
Thank you for your talk. So you brought up history as an example of a field that, since it's not reproducible, it may not be susceptible to the same sort of scientific methods. But you also just barely brought up an example of a historical fact that is informed by science, namely the age of the universe. So sort of along those lines, do you think that these can really be separated as well? These fields are not scientific, these are. And can science actually have some, or in the same way that you brought up examples from the observational sciences where reproducibility doesn't mean repeating an experiment, but it means having multiple sources. It seems that's very applicable to history as well, and even religious history.
Okay, so that's a very good question, first of all, and I think you can draw a distinction. Actually, you didn't ask the question in the hardest way. The way to ask it is this. Well, what about the Big Bang? First of all, isn't that historical? First of all, isn't it a one-off thing? You can't have a repeatable Big Bang, okay? And so how can yours, and isn't the Big Bang something which is discovered by science, okay? So the answer to that question is, yes, the Big Bang is a one-off, but it's not a one-off in the same sense that Julius Caesar's assassination in Rome was. The Big Bang leaves us enormous amounts of scientific, reproducible observational evidence that we can verify and pursue. And the same is true of the age of the universe. So the age of the universe is a kind of general statement about natural history, whereas, Caesar's assassination is a very particular event of a personal nature. And so there's a distinction between natural history about generalities and, let's say, human history about specifics. And I think most historians are not people who talk about the Big Bang, and the age of the universe. They're people who talk about Julius Caesar or Alexander or whoever, okay? So in other words, most historians are historians of human history rather than of natural history. And so I think nevertheless, your point is well taken, and I wouldn't want to give the impression that because of its methods, science can say nothing about the past. It can say a lot about the past. And we can, for example, find out a great deal about the past history of the climate by drilling holes and getting ice cores and analyzing them to find out what was the level of oxygen, for the past million or more years. So science is very powerful to say, to give us facts about the past, but they're not the kind of specific, unreproducible events of individual, personal, or human history. So that would be the distinction that I would draw. Thank you.
Next question over here.
Hi, Dr. Hutchinson. I was wondering if you thought that the current model of the Big Bang Theory supports the idea of intelligent design. And along those lines, is it reasonable to say, well, we don't understand, or for me, I don't understand what happened before that initial Big Bang moment, so let's suppose God exists. Is it reasonable to say that?
Okay. Intelligent design. Christians believe that God created the world and that God is intelligent. So all Christians, in some sense, believe in intelligent design. Okay, little I, little d. Okay, there is nevertheless in our society, particularly in America today, a movement which calls itself intelligent design, capital I, capital D, and that movement is founded on a fairly small number of arguments that there are irreproducibly complex biological structures that couldn't have evolved by natural selection, and that there are arguments concerning information that make it impossible that the world could have come about by evolution. Those are rather specific arguments. They're arguments which I personally don't find terribly persuasive, okay? But I do think there are lots of things about natural science which are suggestive of a creator. And I believe that it's remarkable when you realize that only 50 years or so ago, a large number of cosmologists thought that the universe was eternal, that it had no beginning. And yet we now know that it did have a beginning, and had a beginning, as I said, 13 point something billion years ago. So that's an area where, for example, the development of modern science has actually proven to be quite hospitable to, let's say, religious viewpoints, Christian and Jewish viewpoints, that the earth actually had a beginning and was created. So I think there is actually within the intellectual community, let's say, a slightly cautious, maybe chastened view that there are actually some rather good philosophical arguments related to science that suggest that a good explanation of why the universe is the way it is, why it is at all, apart from the fact that, why it is the way it is, actually is because it was created by God. I don't think those are knockdown arguments. I don't think they prove, in some kind of rigorous way that there exists a God. But I think the theistic viewpoint is intellectually defensible and quite intellectually attractive these days. So that would be my viewpoint.
Next question over here.
Hi, I'm Shayok Banerjee from Mechanical Engineering Department. I had a quick question about the contribution of ethics, the relationship between ethics and religion. So apart from, say, social Darwinism and its contemporaries, we have several traditions of secular ethics like utilitarianism, consequentialism, and rights theory by John Rawls that has, I would say, extremely influential in shaping how the ethics is shaped in the modern world. So what would you consider the superiority of religious ethics when considered against these kinds of normative secular ethical theory that is very influential today?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes. Ethics is a very interesting and rapidly developing area of thought in respect to religious. I mean, to give you a quick answer, short answer to your question, is that religious ethics have normative foundations. And I would argue that secular or evolutionary ethics do not. So what does that mean? People argue that our moral and ethical positions are, in a certain sense, programmed into us by the way we've evolved, that we've learned as individuals and societies certain types of reaction that are essentially programmed into us by evolution, and that these are universal. Now, Christians don't deny that there are universals of ethics. Certainly, Christians have always affirmed that there is conscience, and actually there's a Christian expression to describe this, which is the common grace. So Christians don't claim that they've got some kind of monopoly on ethical behavior and that we know what to do and others don't know. We say, no, people do know what to do. In fact, the whole Christian message is, in a certain sense, you do know what to do, but you know you can't live up to that, knowing that. And that's what a large part of Christian message is about. But to come back then to this question of, well, aren't the secular approaches to ethics just as good or maybe even superior? I would argue that certainly if you have a theistic position, then you believe that ethics is not simply pragmatism. There is pragmatism in ethics, even to a Christian, but that is not merely pragmatism. Okay. Now, does this have any force in the modern world? To a secularist, no. He's shaking his head. Okay. He's not persuaded. He does not feel that he is that those types of ethics are important for him or her or whoever it might be. But I think that would be what I would point to. The ethical argument is nevertheless remains that if you take a secularist viewpoint, You can argue about pragmatism, you can argue about various approaches to developing ethical systems, but none of those is authoritative for anybody. And so Nietzsche basically had it right. If God is dead, then there is nothing to compel me to behave in a humane way. And I believe that's true, and it's chilling. Thank you.
We started a few minutes late, and so we're going to run a few minutes over. We have about 12 minutes left, so we're going to try to get through the last 4 questions, but we'll just try to keep mind of that clock. Next question over here.
Thank you for the talk, Professor. Based on your answers to 2 previous questions about the origin of the universe and about evolution or the origin of life, it sounds like if modern science offers an explanation for the way the world, or for the way the universe is now, then you're willing to take that over perhaps an explanation from Christianity if it pertains directly to something that can alternately be explained by natural sciences. And I'm wondering if you think that extends to all claims about I guess, natural sciences, and you would be willing to accept modern deductions from, physics or whatever natural sciences there are over from Christianity, and also how that pertains to miracles and yeah.
Okay, I thought we were going to get there. Yeah. Thanks. So this is a question about miracles, okay? I don't mean to bypass the question. I think it's a question. You mean it to be a question about miracles, okay? I mean, the reason why that was a helpful clarification at the end there is because of course I'm a scientist, I'm a physicist, so I mean I'm doing physics all the time, so of course I believe, in a certain sense, I believe in the laws of physics, okay? But the crucial, but the crucial question is it compulsory in order to practice science, physics, or whatever it might be, to believe that the laws of physics or nature are inviolable? And so it's often the case that the secularists of today will insist that the only way you can make sense of science is to believe that the laws of nature are inviolable. They can never be broken. They can't be violated, okay? My answer to that is that wasn't the belief of the people who founded modern science. Boyle and Newton and Galileo, for that matter, and all the people who founded modern science, vast fraction of those were Christians who had no problem with miracles. Maxwell, Faraday, whoever. So it can't possibly be the case that you have to believe in the inviolability of natural laws in order to be a scientist or in order to make sense of the world through natural science. And so my simple question is, or my simple answer to your question is, it's perfectly fine to do physics, and I accept physics, believe in physics in a certain sense, provided it's not turned into metaphysics. And if you turn your physics into metaphysics, if you insist that somehow there's a metaphysical reason why the laws of science have to apply and can never, nothing outside of the normal description can ever happen, then you've made a metaphysical statement. Just to finish off the point. Science, natural science, studies the world insofar as it evidences the reproducibility that science insists upon. If something irreproducible happens, science is at a loss. It doesn't know what to do, because if something is inherently irreproducible, science can't, in a certain sense, analyze it. And that, I would say, and this is coming back to the miracles thing, that is the nature of a miracle. It's always been the case that it's been argued a miracle is a unique event that can't be reproduced. And in a certain sense, science is kind of powerless to do anything about that. It could, you can assume that miracles don't happen, but you can't, in the end, I would argue, investigate a miracle in the same way that you would investigate the normal course of events. So thanks for that question. Yeah.
Next question over here.
Hi. My question is this. Dr. Hutchinson, Christians often criticize atheists and scientists for talking about religion despite their lack of professional knowledge about the subject. Now I get to extend that same argument to you. I studied the Bible at Harvard Divinity School, and claiming that the Bible is a reliable source of knowledge is just silly. At Harvard, we understood the Bible was a heavily edited text, changed and rearranged throughout history. Here I must refer you to Bart D. Ehrman's rather definitive scholarship on the contradictions in the Bible. So given these numerous contradictions, why do you claim to know Jesus died and was resurrected based on the testimony of 4 people who never met Jesus and against overwhelming scientific evidence? It seems like you might have a double standard for truth.
Well, what's the overriding scientific evidence that you're offering me? That isn't scientific evidence about a miracle, as we've just been discussing. So if you start with the assumption that miracles don't happen, then miracles don't happen. So I would argue that in actual fact, scholarship shows that, first of all, the text of the New Testament is extremely reliable. We have vast numbers of manuscripts that date back to the earliest centuries. Certainly there are areas where there are iffy bits that we're not quite sure about. But as a whole, in generalities, and speaking of the whole picture, the New Testament is an extremely reliable document. You might not believe that it's true, and clearly you don't, okay?
Sir, we will have a reception afterwards.
So let me just remark on the question of contradictions. If you have a determination that you wish to find ways in which any document is inconsistent with itself, you will find them, okay? And there are undoubtedly places in the New Testament where there are different readings, there are different portrayals, and so forth. And that's been known by Christians for centuries, and it hasn't particularly troubled them, okay, in the sense that it hasn't led most Christians to believe that the Bible is, I can't remember how you described it, just implying that it was unreliable. I think there are very good reasons that have been written about and talked about very extensively. There are large numbers of books that explore this question. And I wouldn't for a moment say that there is some kind of knockdown proof that the resurrection, for example, is an historical fact that is incapable of disbelief. But by the same token, I think there is a good argument for it. And in the end, it's the kind of event you have to assess from the point of view of the best understanding that you can give. You obviously don't find the New Testament persuasive. I do.
And like I said, we will have time at the reception afterwards for more questions. We have time for 2 more questions, so we're going to take this question here, and then our last question will be over there.
Thank you for your talk. In the talk, you said that science and faith are mutually corrective. You didn't have time to go into examples, but you gave one example of how science corrected faith in its measurement of the age of the universe being corrective of a literal reading of the Bible. I want to ask if you could provide an example in the other direction, where faith modified science within science's own field.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think there are at least 2 types of ways in which you can think of religion or faith correcting or constraining or assisting science. In the first place, I think the faith of the people who founded the scientific revolution was an important part of what led them to the new understanding that they came to of going about understanding the world. And I won't unpack that in detail, but a strong case can be made that the reason why modern science grew up in the Christian West was that far from being an inhospitable philosophical and theological climate for science to grow, in fact, Christianity and biblical understanding of the world was very hospitable to the development of science, and that's why science grew up when it did and where it did. So that's one approach. I mean, the other approach is to say, well, if any of you do research that involves human subjects, and if you get any funding from the government, then you are obliged to be subject in your institution here at Stanford to a committee that is charged with ensuring that you observe certain ethical and moral standards in the way that you do that research, that that there's safety and there's respect and people know what they're getting into and all these kinds of things. I don't remember all of the regulations. So there is an example where religious, or at the very least ethical, aspects constrain the way that science goes on. Now, the answer to that is always, oh, but ethics isn't religious, okay? But
I actually want to argue that point. I would simply say that's not within science. That's science.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. Someone was coughing.
I wouldn't make that argument right now. I would simply say that the application of science is different from science itself and any.
No.
The science's understanding of how things work is what I'm really driving at. Is there a time that faith
I don't think you can separate the two. I don't think you can separate the two. You're trying to say there is some idealized knowledge out there that is somehow ready to be plucked by science, and how is that somehow helped by a religious viewpoint? But that's not what I'm addressing. I'm saying I don't think that somehow exists. I think that science is a process. It's a set of methods, and I would argue those methods. I've argued that they are assisted or were assisted historically by a theological point of view, and I'm also illustrating the fact that they are also constrained by topics which are certainly not scientific, and I would argue are predominantly religious, even today within our society. And so I would say that, my statement is that science and religion mutually correct and constrain one another. So that would be the illustration. Sorry, that's the best I can do.
And for our last question, over here.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. So I guess the talk that we've kind of had for the past hour or so has been looking at science and saying that scientism, which is sort of a religious application of science, so to speak, that it believes that science is the only thing, and it's in some ways infallible, and that things are of I guess a religious mindset that's problematic because it doesn't cover everything. Where I guess I see it as if you're arguing against science as a religion, and instead saying can't just have science. There's also all these other things that religion, and I guess religion is just kind of a broad sense, covers. Then I guess as science is seeking to forever evolve, that's the whole point of science, is that we know this right now. Maybe let's see if we can figure out further. If you could talk briefly about how, as a religion, if you were going to pick a religion, why a religion that intrinsically decides that it's probably not correct is a religion that you wouldn't want to choose instead of, say, an established, such as a specific like Christianity, which, as a lot of the traditional religions in the past and probably in the future will be, have kind of had a, we are right, this is how it is, these are the facts we understand, whereas science has the additional clause of probably.
Well, I don't want to overstate the issue concerning scientism as a religion. I do want to say that it functions sort of as a religion. I would say most people who adopt the scientific viewpoint don't think of it in those terms these days. They did once, the positivists did once. And sometimes they do still, for example, in talking about sociobiology. I think so that's not the main point of what I want to say. The main point of what I want to say is that the belief that really science is the only type of knowledge that counts cannot be consistently maintained on any kind of reasonable philosophical basis. And there is so much more to life than what we can establish by science. Science itself cannot even function until we have in place things like language, the fundamental knowledge that we have of the world and various skills, which in a certain sense are not scientific. They're not things which we learn from the study of the natural world. And so the main point of what I'm trying to say is that we need to step back and say, what are the things that go to make up knowledge, and to what extent can religious knowledge or claims be given credence? And I believe there are rational bases on which one can believe in Christianity that may not be scientific, but are nevertheless the kinds of knowledge that are commonplace in our world and in our academy. So that's really, I think, where I would leave it, except to say, if you want, the way you put it is, why would I choose one religion versus another? I would certainly say that to me, Christianity is attractive precisely because it gives room for science and it addresses the big questions of life. Not just how did the universe come to be here, but why is it here? And those big questions are the kinds of questions that I think the Veritas forums are very good at raising and discussing. So thank you for your question.
I'd like to thank all of the individuals who came out and asked all these great questions. And before I ask you to join me in thanking Professor Hutchinson, I have a short list of individuals that I would like to give some credit to for this event. Cardinal Life Christian Fellowship, Chi Alpha Christian Fellowship, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, InterVarsity Graduate Christian Fellowship, Reformed University Fellowship, and Christians in Business all came together and put in a lot of time and effort. There was an amazing committee of students that worked to put this on. And of course, the co-sponsorship of the Veritas Forum is always greatly appreciated. And so therefore, I would like to ask you all to thank Professor Hutchinson along with me for this evening.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.